I'd like to welcome everybody to today's meeting of the Ethnicity, Race and Racism seminar here at Edge Hill University here on May Day, traditionally a day of radicalism, and we have a radical topic for discussion. My name is James Renton. I teach history here at Edge Hill. I'm one of the conveners of the Ethnicity, Race and Racism seminar. My area of research, one of my principal focuses of research, is on the British Empire in the Middle Eastern world and its legacies. And one of the topics that I've concentrated on in my work is Palestine, British rule in Palestine, which is our subject for today. And the question that we're going to be engaging with is, should the British government apologise for British rule in Palestine? Now, Britain occupied Palestine during the First World War, ending 4 centuries of Ottoman rule in that territory. And before Britain arrived, the Zionist movement was really at a low ebb. And also we can say that there was no organised, statist Palestinian nationalist movement in existence. And yet 30 years later, when British rule came to an ignominious end in 1948, 30 years later, there was a full-blown statist nationalist conflict between Zionism and Palestinian nationalism, between two movements fighting for national sovereignty in the same land. Now, the British ruled Palestine under a mandate from the League of Nations, with a whole series of obligations that they had to adhere to. Now, when we consider the question of whether Britain should apologise for their tenure in Palestine, it's not merely the arguable case that one can make that British rule created, or at least led to, a statist conflict between Zionists and Palestinians. There is a long charge sheet that we can point to. If we can look to the Zionist, traditional Zionist perspective on British rule in Palestine, the dominant narrative is that the British betrayed Zionism. That in the First World War, the British promised to facilitate the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. And for many Zionists, they felt that the ensuing decades was a period in which Britain backtracked on what Zionists believed was the promise to create a Jewish state. For many Zionists, they thought that the British were determined to pander to Palestinian Arab sentiment. And for them, the high watermark of this betrayal was in 1939, when on the eve of European Jewry's most desperate hour, Britain sharply curtailed the possibilities of Jewish immigration into Palestine. And for many Zionists, therefore, the fact that the State of Israel came into being upon the departure of the British in 1948, it was in spite of British policy, not because of it. The other side of the coin is the traditional Palestinian narrative, which is that actually the British colluded with Zionism to steal the land from the Palestinians. That the Palestinians did not get what they deserved on the basis of the post-war settlement in the Middle East, which was based upon the principle of self-determination. That their rights to self-determination in their own land was stolen from them by the Zionist movement in collaboration, in cahoots, in collusion with colonial Britain. Now, aside from these broad charges that we can speak of, there's also the specific acts of violent brutality undertaken by British forces when they crushed the Palestinian rebellion against Britain and its support for Zionism between 1936 to 1939. A brutality that included collective punishments, that included reprisal, attacks of murder, a concerted attempt to try to violently crush the rebellion, not just through fighting the rebels themselves, but actually through a whole legal military apparatus designed to break the will of the Palestinian population. And if you would bear with me, I would just like to read from an article published by Jacob Norris on British policy towards the Palestinian rebellion that was published a few years ago in the Journal of Imperial Commonwealth History. And it's just a short excerpt from the article. It's referring to somebody who was fighting with British forces in Palestine. And the extract goes as follows. Arthur Lane, meanwhile, recalls the brutal treatment of 7 Arab rebels who were captured by his regiment following a skirmish in late 1938. The rebels were first beaten by the British troops with rifle butts and bayonets. This lad's eye was hanging down on his cheek. The whole eye had been knocked out, and it was hanging down, and there was blood dripping on his face. The captives were then made to run a gauntlet consisting of 2 lines of British soldiers armed with pickaxes and bayonet scabbards. Now, any that could run when they got to the other end would run straight into the police meat wagon, recalled Lane, and they were sent down to Acre, to the prison. Any that died, they went straight into the other meat wagon, and they were dumped at one of the villages on the outside. By 1939, 9,000 Palestinian Arabs were imprisoned. It's been estimated in this period 2,000 houses were demolished as part of the British campaign to, as I've said, not just defeat the rebels, but to absolutely crush the will to support the cause against British colonial rule within the Palestinian Arab community. So there are these issues of colonial state violence in Palestine against the Palestinian Arabs. There is the question of whether or not Britain adhered to its promise to facilitate the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, whether it broke the terms of the mandate by sharply curtailing Jewish immigration into Palestine just when European Jewry needed somewhere to escape to. And there's the charge that the elements of the terms of the mandate that were put in place to protect the non-Jewish population were also not adhered to. And the question you may well be asking is, this all happened quite a long time ago. Why are we talking about it now? And the reason is there's a wider context to this question of an apology for Palestine, and that is a wider post-colonial context. It's indeed trying to situate Palestine, colonial Palestine, within the wider context of memory and legacies and restitution, within the wider frame of this story in the British Empire, that we would like to talk about this question of Palestine today. And the trigger for all of this has been a case brought by Kenyans who were tortured and abused by the British military in the 1950s in the attempt to crush the Mau Mau rebellion against British colonial rule. And there was a case brought against the British government, a case to win the right to claim damages from the government, which the British government, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, tried to stop. But in a landmark judgment in October 2012, the High Court deemed that there was a case to be answered. And the British government can continue to try to fight against this judgment, but ended up coming to an agreement with the claimants. And there was a statement made by William Hague, Foreign Secretary, in June of 2013, statement to Parliament, which is very pertinent for our consideration of Palestine and indeed the whole post-colonial world in our discussion today. And I'll just quote this from you before we move into our specific discussion of an apology for Palestine. William Hague said, "I would like to make clear now and for the first time on behalf of Her Majesty's Government that we understand the pain and grievance felt by those who were involved in the events of the emergency in Kenya. The British Government recognises that Kenyans were subject to torture and other forms of ill treatment at the hands of the colonial administration. The British Government sincerely regrets that these abuses took place and that they marred Kenya's progress towards independence. Torture and ill treatment are abhorrent violations of human dignity which we unreservedly condemn. I can announce today," Hague continued, "that the government has now reached an agreement with Lee Day, the solicitors acting on behalf of the claimants, in full and final settlement of their clients' claims. The agreement includes payment of a settlement sum in respect of 5,228 claimants, as well as a gross cost sum to the value of £19.9 million. The government will also support the construction of a memorial in Nairobi to the victims of torture and ill treatment during the colonial era. The memorial will stand alongside others that are already being established in Kenya as the country continues to heal the wounds of the past. And the British High Commissioner in Nairobi is also today making a public statement to members of the Mau Mau War Veterans Association in Kenya, explaining the settlement and expressing our regret for the events of the emergency period. So far, so sorry, or at least regretful." But he then continued, "We, the British government, continue to deny liability on behalf of the government and British taxpayers today for the actions of the colonial administration in respect of the claims, and indeed the courts have made no finding of liability against the government in this case. We do not believe that claims relating to events that occurred overseas outside direct British jurisdiction more than 50 years ago can be resolved satisfactorily through the courts without the testimony of key witnesses that is no longer available. It is therefore right that the government has defended the case to this point since 2009. So, the British government expresses its regret with regard to Kenya after it's lost its case in the High Court, but still claims that it's not liable for what happened in Kenya, and that this expression of regret and this judgment doesn't set a precedent for the rest of the British Empire. Well, I think there's a lot up for debate in the words put forward by the British Foreign Secretary. And today we're going to talk about this question of a potential apology for Palestine, and we're going to specifically be talking about an international campaign that is being pursued over the next years in time for the 100th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration by the Palestinian Return Centre in London. And I would like to welcome today Nasim Ahmed, who's the head of research at the PRC, who's come up from London to discuss their campaign with us. I'd like to thank you, Nasim, for coming.
Thank you.
Nasim has agreed to answer a number of questions that I have about their campaign, and after Nasim has answered those, we'll open it up for discussion to the audience here. So, Nasim, I'd like to begin by just asking you if you could explain to us where the apology campaign idea by the PRC came from.
First of all, I want to say thank you to James and the Department of History for inviting me to this event and also taking interest in our campaign. I want to thank you all for coming as well. I'm really delighted to be here and taking interest in our campaign. It's not just our campaign, it's actually, I would say, a global Palestinian campaign. We want to galvanize support for this anniversary, which is coming on 2017. And 2017 is actually a watershed moment for the Palestinians. The Balfour Declaration is a watershed moment for the Palestinians. And it's not just the declaration itself, it symbolizes more than just the declaration. It symbolizes 22 decades of British mandate and policy within Palestine. So for the Palestinians, there was a clear sense that they had to do something significant for 1917. And one of the significant things which was decided by PRC was to have an international campaign to highlight the, not the Balfour Declaration so much, but Balfour Declaration as a trigger to show and demonstrate the failures of British policy and British human rights abuse in Palestine from 1922 all the way up to the end of its mandate in 1948. So there was a sense that they needed to do something and demonstrate and show to the world, educate, and if possible to see if there's a legal course that could be taken against the British government, like the Mamo case. But that's the thinking behind it, to actually commemorate the 1917 date with something significant globally to raise awareness and show that Britain still has a case to answer for Palestine.
Thank you very much. May I ask, was the PRC and its campaign influenced by the Mau Mau case?
I think the legal side has been something that was introduced later after having seen the Mau Mau case and the arguments that were put forward, because the legal element is not clear-cut. I think morally and politically, an apology which the PRC is seeking for the British government is quite clear. There is, as we will discuss, a balance sheet, a charge sheet which we can put forward to the British government and say, here are certain things which you failed in and you need to apologise to the Palestinians for those failures, because for the Palestinians, British policy meant a reversal of their culture, reversal of their history, and really a damage to their political aspiration. That's how they see it. And so morally and politically, I think it was very clear that there's an apology that needs to be made. But on the legal side, I think there is an avenue which needs to be refined and be made more sophisticated, because to do that, we will need to identify individual Palestinians to actually take a legal case forward for British atrocities in Palestine. So that's something that's work in progress that needs to be done more and refined. So that's the influence of the Mau Mau case on our own campaign, to how we can actually pursue a similar legal course in addition to the apology, which to us is quite clear and clearly communicable to the masses around the world.
Do you see the PRC campaign as part of a wider post-colonial context, something beyond the Israel-Palestine conflict itself? I mean, is that useful for the PRC to look at the issue in that colonial context more broadly?
I think it is not only just to raise awareness of how the past in Palestine still haunts the present. I mean, Palestine, history tells over Palestine. I mean, first of all, the Jewish claim to Palestine goes back millenniums. For the Palestinians, I don't think the wounds of 1948 has been healed. So for the Palestinian refugees and many Palestinians around the world, until there's a final resolution to the conflict, British mandate and 1948, which they mark as the Nakba, will be an open wound until it's healed. So for them, there is no question. That point of their history has not been fully resolved. I know many people around the world think the Palestinian issue is really post-1967. There's two schools of thought. One is post-1967. The issue is occupation. The issue is not what happened in 1948. But for the majority of the Palestinians, the issue is 1948. And the problems following the British mandate up until 1948 has not been resolved. And there needs to be a clear awareness of what Britain did with regards to Palestine, so that those chapters of their history can actually be resolved and they can actually move on. So it's not been resolved. You had a case in Australia after many centuries where you had an apology case which went on for 10 years because there was a clear recognition that, that recognition means a lot to the, not just politically, but to the individual Palestinians, that no, our persecution is not something we're imagining, it's something that happened, and there was an agent, which is the British government, which actually allowed our abuse of human rights from up until 1948. So this is something which needs to be understood more clearly.
Presumably, though, the outcome of the Mau case, for all of the differences that you see with it, surely must have galvanised those behind the PRC's apology movement.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, the Mau case came up many times. I actually wrote a report on the connection between Mau and Palestine, and that's something that was the PRC, the director, some of the other heads who actually translated into Arabic, and they spoke to the Palestinian refugees about how there is a correlation, there is a link, and the only problem, as we sit politically, the Palestinian issue is very difficult to pursue as a legal case. It's very difficult politically because the political situation has to change for it to be pursued more as a legal case. International law is very much influenced by what's happening politically on the ground. So there is this awareness, but there are many parallels, and we took a lot of confidence from the judgment, the fact that there is no limitation on statutory limitation on the time. You know, just because the Mau case goes back to 1950, it does not mean that Britain has a case to answer. Britain does have a case to answer. So that was a great, confidence booster for the PRC and many of the Palestinians. And they feel that with that judgment, they can actually take a similar case on a parallel line as the Mau case. That's what they believe. And I think it's true.
I suppose one of the major differences, though, speaking in the colonial context when we're talking about Palestine, is that it's not just a question of Britain, the British government, and the Palestinians, but also Zionism. So how does that element affect the movement for an apology for British rule in Palestine, politically, morally? How is that an issue that can be resolved, or is it just simply that the PRC will just focus on a Palestinian perspective in trying to secure an apology for Britain?
As I said, I think morally and politically there's a clear argument which everyone will understand regarding British apology. Why does Britain need to apologise? There's a clear argument about that. And in the course of making that argument by PRC and other organisations, because there are other organisations, one in Edinburgh, which is calling for an apology and raise awareness of the Balfour Declaration and British policy in Palestine. So in the course of raising awareness, of course, there will be highlighting of British, shall I say, favoritism towards a Zionist organisation, towards Zionism in Israel, and towards, so that's inevitable, you can't avoid that. So, but the goal for PRC is specifically seeking an apology from Britain. It's not seeking an apology from Israel, it's not seeking an apology from any Zionist organisation or Jewish World Jew or anything like that. They're very specific in targeting Britain because Britain was, as I said, marked an historical point where it ended their pursuit for self-determination. If you think about what Britain did, here you have Palestine, a Mandate A country which was given to Britain. Britain has jurisdiction to actually take Palestine into fulfilling their self-determination, become an independent state. And by the time Britain left, it left Palestine poorer than it was. It left Palestine broken politically. It destroyed their political elites and class. 10% of their population from 1936 to 1939 were either in prison or killed. So you can see that the British, I'll give you one stat. Britain, before it left Palestine, had 100,000 soldiers in Palestine. And this is a country which is no bigger than Wales. And Britain ruled India, which is far vaster in size, with only 12,000 soldiers. So 12,000 in India, 100,000 in Palestine. And 30% of British budget in Palestine went into security, which was really enforcement of repressive measures against the Palestinians. So the Balfour Declaration, the British policy of trying to reconcile two irreconcilable goals, could not be achieved without severe repression. So for the Palestinians, that is a historical wound and a clear, shift in what should have been a realization of the Palestinian state. This is what they were striving for, a Palestinian state where Jews, Christians and Muslims and non-religious had a stake within the country. But that's something that was totally, in their mind, wiped out or nullified by British policy in the 2 decades or 3 decades.
But I wonder if it might be possible to think about an apology campaign for getting Britain to say sorry for the mess that they left in Israel-Palestine, for the way in which their actions led to a status conflict, and not just from a Palestinian perspective. Certainly in terms of the way in which we understand what the British were trying to achieve and what they ended up leaving behind in Palestine, we need to establish motives. And there is clearly a case that's been made in the past, on the one hand, from the 1920s. On the one hand, Palestinians saying the British are betraying the Palestinians, and the Zionists on the other hand saying, the British are betraying the Zionists. And there seems to be a bit of a ping-pong debate that Britain was on either one side or another. And certainly from my own research, I seem to see a great deal more ambivalence with regard to the British approach, certainly towards Zionism. The idea that they were trying to steal Palestine from the Arabs and help to create the Jewish state, I think it is belied by the ambivalence that we see in the documentary record. For example, even Lloyd George, widely celebrated in scholarship and popular mythology as this great champion of Zionism, but who actually confided in a private letter in February 1919 that the Zionists were wishing to dominate Palestine. They were aiming too high. So perhaps the question of whether the British were on one side or another is a bit of a murky area, and I wonder what we can see though, what we can see is that British policies, whatever their intentions, led to this violent status conflict, and perhaps there should be a movement for an apology for the conflict, that Israel, Palestine and the world is still mired into this day.
Well, I think for Palestinians, the idea that Britain should apologise for just the conflict alone, I don't think it's something they can digest. If you think about the situation, here Britain takes mandate of Palestine. At that time, there's only 10% Jews, 90% Palestinians, give or take a few percentage here and there. And the result of British policy is that the creation of the State of Israel, the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, what they call the Nakba in 1948, even while Britain was in authority in its mandate in 1948, 400,000 Palestinians were actually expelled. This is while Britain had still the mandatory power in Palestine. So for the Palestinians, when they look back at their history, I don't think, even with all the ambivalence and the British failure to clarify what was their position, did they want a Jewish state or did they not want a Jewish state? Was it just a Jewish homeland or was it something more? So even with the ambivalence about what it is that Britain wanted, what is their policy, the facts on the ground is that it was the Palestinians who were vastly, majority in numbers. It was them who were expelled from their homes and not been allowed to return to their homes. It was their self-determination which was totally erupted by the British authorities. It was their progress that was stifled. And And for them, what was enhanced and promoted was the Zionism and their aspirations to create a homeland which became a state, which maybe not be what Britain wanted, but the facts on the ground was that the Zionist organizations were able to actually use Britain to their benefit. So that's something which Britain has to answer the Palestinians for. If you were neutral, why is it that Britain was able to implement the first part of the Balfour Declaration, which is to promote a Jewish homeland, maybe not a state which they wanted, but a Jewish homeland which led to a state, but they totally failed in the second part of the clause, the safeguard clause, which is to say that nothing will be done to prejudice the rights, the cultural and the religious rights of the indigenous non-Jewish community. So it failed totally on the second part. So here again, it's the non-Jewish community, if you want to call them the non-Jewish community. Of course, we talk about the Palestinians. It is their right to pursue British failure on the second part of that clause. Of course, they promoted the creation of a Jewish homeland, which became a state. A state is better than the homeland. So Britain supported that in one way or another, and they totally failed in the second part of the clause, which is to protect the indigenous community, their religious, their cultural rights, and their human rights. Excuse me.
Thanks. I think certainly from a traditional Zionist point of view, I think they would see 1948 as a struggle. Before the struggle against Palestinians and the Arab world, there was an anti-colonial struggle against the British oppressor, and they saw Ernest Bevin, the British Foreign Secretary, as this anti-Zionist, for them, anti-Semitic character, who certainly believed that the Jewish state was going to be a satellite for the Soviet Union. And for him, as a person obsessed with the threat from the Soviet Union and the emerging Cold War, there couldn't be a greater problem thrown in the midst of Britain's imperial strategic interests in the Middle East. But one can debate the issue of British intentions and its ambivalences and its attitudes, but what one can't deny is that when the British left, as you say, the State of Israel was established, the first Arab-Israeli war began, the Palestinians were defeated, and 750,000 Palestinian refugees fled from their homes. And on that note, I think it's probably a good time for us to open up the discussion to the floor. So,
yeah. I just wanted to add, before the British mandate, before British took over Palestine, Palestine was in relative peace, relatively prosperous, probably more prosperous than in any other neighbouring Arab country. After British left, Palestine was in total breakdown, politically, socially, economically, in every sense. So it's the variable there is 2 decades of British mandate, British failure, where you had a community which was progressing nicely in its historical pursuit for self-determination and realization of their aspirations, whatever. And Britain had a clear mandate to actually support them in this, to create the institutions, help them to create the institutions, to become a nation state like everyone else, and not interrupt that natural progress, historical progress. But when Britain left, it was a total interruption of historical progress, cultural, religious progress, political realization. So it was Britain which was a key variable in the 2 decades which interrupted Palestine from its natural course, which would have been a realization of a Palestinian state with Jews, Christians and Muslims. That would have been the realization, a secular Palestinian state. That's what Britain ultimately wanted. I think Britain, if you look at the documents, if you look at the mandate and the statements which you've mentioned yourself, if, like for example, if the Zionists wanted to dominate Palestine, then they're thinking they're thinking too high, which is what Lloyd George actually said in a statement. So I think Britain did not want a Jewish state. I think they wanted a Palestinian state because they knew this was morally and ethically, legally, politically the right thing to do. And to say that they would create a Jewish state in 1948 would have been a total denial of everything which the international community stood for at the time, total rejection of the Wilson's 14-point plan of all the decolonized areas of the world which should become a nation state. It was going against the grain of history at the time. So that was not even in the question of, I don't think, British administrators that there will be an Israeli state. They wanted a Palestinian state, but they fell on the ground drastically, dramatically, and this failure needs to be recognized, and that the Palestinians are the victims of this. They're not the perpetrators, they're the victims of this failure. And Israel has become a flourishing country. They're flourishing now as a state, but the Palestinians still, 6 decades on, are refugees. They've not been allowed any kind of return or restoration, repatriation. So this is still ongoing for the Palestinians in the worst way. So I just want to add that last point before we go to the question and answers.
Thank you. Well, I shall resist the temptation to make another point myself. Okay. Otherwise, we'll be here all afternoon, won't we?
Yeah, definitely.
So please, let's open it up to the floor. Who would like to begin? And when you ask a question, could you just please introduce yourself? We have a question at the back there.
Yeah, Charlie with a history. Thanks for coming, by the way. My question is about the Arab states today. I mean, part of the problems the British had, of course, in interwar years, their equivocation with the Zionist cause is they wanted to keep the Arab states in play with British imperial interest, didn't they? Yeah. So they were playing them off as well, trying to keep in with the Arabs, but in with the Zionists as well. Yeah. We know we paid the biggest price for that. But what today, though, the Arab world is quite different, and I just wonder what their response has been. Those Arab states have a government that is credible, of course, at the moment, but like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, UAE, what's their response been to the notion of an apology of the Palestinian cause? Because it's been used, the Palestinian cause, of course, in the post-war period has been used and abused by the Arab states, hasn't it? For their own, to their own ends partly as well. So I just wonder what their response would be. Has there been any response from them to the notion of an apology?
Well, we haven't approached for a statement from the Arab states. I don't think it's got to that stage yet. At the moment, it's a grassroots movement of various different organisations around Europe mainly, because it's really an apology from Britain, and I don't think it's come under the radar of many of the Arab countries. But on a broader question about Arab states and Palestine, I think on an issue like this, for an apology by Palestinian organisation or Palestinians for a British apology, I can't imagine some of the Arab countries actually endorsing something like this, because it's given the situation now in the Middle East, there's a cold war within the Middle East. So any issue would be used to actually promote their own political agenda. So the Palestinian issue, if more so now than before, is something which they would use to actually garner support for themselves and shore up their position, whether it be against Islamist Brotherhood in Egypt or somewhere else. But the Palestinian issue would be something like something which they can use to enhance and promote their positions, more so now than before. So I don't think we will try and get an endorsement from any Arab countries. That's not our goal. Our intention is to specifically focus on organisations and communities in Europe, in UK, and demonstrate and show to the British government, look, there's a huge swell of public opinion getting hundreds of thousands of signatures around Europe and here in the UK is no mean feat. And if we could do that, it will show that there's a huge swell of opinion within Europe to say that Britain has a question to answer in Palestine, and you need to actually address this. Whether from that there is a legal case, as I said, it's a different issue, it's a different question, but at the moment it's not something which we will get Arab countries to actually endorse. They're not in a position to actually endorse something like this. If anything, they'll use that to their advantage. So that's not something that will be done in the short term, I don't think.
I'm a Chelsea student here. Just wondering, would you seek a similar apology from the international community on behalf of the League of Nations? After all, it was their mandate that Britain was following, and if Britain hadn't have implemented it correctly, surely they should have stepped in and ensured that Britain were upholding the obligations.
I mean, that's probably an argument for that, but I think politically and also just it's not something that will stick. You know, you want an apology from everyone. It just sounds. I mean, Britain specifically were the ones who promoted the idea of Jewish homeland in Palestine. They were the ones, even before they were given the mandate in 1922, they were the ones who were thinking of engineering a new political scenario in Palestine in 1917 through the Balfour Declaration. So it was them who imagined this new Jewish homeland. It was they who allowed, while they had jurisdiction over Palestine, it was they who allowed many Jewish refugees to come without paying any attention to what that would do, that level of immigration to Palestine, to a small country, what that kind of immigration would do to social and economic situations on the ground. So I don't think they paid any attention to their policies with regards to allowing more and more Jewish. Not to say they did not have a right to go there. They do, of course, especially in the 1930s, suffering in the Second World War, they did. But Britain failed to actually plan for any kind of immigration to Palestine, especially given that they've already made an announcement that this was going to be a Jewish homeland. So again, giving confused messages to the Palestinians. So they failed on those grounds. So it's specifically about Britain apologizing because it was Britain who, as I said, they made the declaration. They wanted to create a Jewish homeland. They allowed the increasing number of refugees without having a strategic plan to incorporate them within the Palestinian communities and economy. And it was them who ultimately failed. So politically and thinking more strategically, it's the one that makes sense. And having an international apology just wouldn't. It might be an argument for it, but I don't think on the ground it would work.
On the other hand, I think it might be worth noting that the United Nations, as the successors of the League, an apology with regard to the Israel-Palestine conflict might have more traction than with regard to the British government, which has a rather different approach. And certainly it is worth noting, in response to Sam's question, that in October 1930, the British government issued a statement of policy that put in place a commitment to being much more diligent in protecting the rights of Palestinian Arabs and also being much more restrictive in its approach to Zionism. But they backed away from that statement of policy in what Palestinians called the Black Letter of February 1931 from the British Prime Minister to the Zionist leader Chaim Weizmann. And one of the reasons why they backed away from that policy was a fear of being brought in front of the League of Nations with the accusation that they were backtracking on their support for Zionism. And I think recently historians have started to pay much more attention to the power and the apparatus of the League of Nations, of its permanent mandates commission that oversaw all of the mandate administrations, and ultimately the League of Nations Council. And certainly it was an issue that the British government was concerned with. So I think perhaps that, I mean, Nasim obviously feels that it's not something that would ever get anywhere, but I think there's certainly a case to be answered on the part perhaps of the United Nations as the successor of the League. For those reasons, certainly the British government in Palestine took very seriously its obligations, so much so that in 1939, where for many it abandoned its support for Zionism, the government tried to present it as actually fully in line with the promises of the Balfour Declaration and the terms of the mandate.
Yeah. I mean, That's right, but I think the other problem with that would be is I don't think there really is any precedent for United Nations apologizing to anyone for anything. I mean, of course, there is this argument the UN had no authority to actually divide Palestine. A General Assembly resolution is not really enforceable. It's just a recommendation. So Resolution 181 is just a recommendation, and that's something that was used to actually divide Palestine. So there's all that. But there's just no precedent. But with individual countries at least apologizing, maybe not a legal case and compensation, but at least apology. You had it in Australia, we have it here in the UK now with the Mau Mau, a recognition that there was a failure and the failure, and there's a consequence of that failure. So there is an awareness that individual states have a responsibility even after half a century. So there's precedence for that, and we are, I think, riding on that precedence. To actually focus on the UN, I think it might be misdirected and time wasted from our calculation.
Okay. Who's next? Lady at the front here, and then two back behind.
Well, I am Nahida, exiled Palestinian since 1967, 47 years of exile. I cannot see how can we pursue the argument of blaming Britain without looking at the Jewish Zionist lobby in Britain at the time of Balfour. The letter of Balfour was written addressed to Rothschild. At the same time, we are living the implications and the activities of the Jewish Zionist lobby worldwide. So, to me, as a Palestinian, they are the real culprits.
Here.
That's number one.
Can we respond to number one, and then come back to number two?
Okay.
Nasim?
Of course, there's many players in this. The Zionist lobbies, which are strong even now.
The vote of the leaders of British Jews.
Yeah, of course. But it's no one can deny there's other players like the Zionist organization here in the UK and the lobbying which they did. But we're talking about a country here. Britain is a nation state, a powerful empire at the time, and they had a responsibility and a duty. We can't say that the Zionist lobbies here in the UK had a duty to protect Palestinian self-determination. We can't say the Jewish lobby around the world had a duty and responsibility to protect Palestinian human rights and see them through their progression to a proper nation state like they did with Iraq and Syria in the case of France. So they did not, and Jordan, so they did not have that responsibility. Britain had a clear mandate, they had a clear responsibility and a duty to see Palestinians through to a proper nation state and realize their self-determination. We can't blame the lobbies for that. We can blame surely an empire. They had power, they had authority. Of course, as part of the campaign, you can highlight that. But if to seek an apology, or to even and more specifically, if you want to pursue a legal case, you have to be very clear and specific what it is that you're aiming for. To have this nebulous term Jewish lobby, it's for an apology, especially definitely for a legal case, that would not work. But for an apology, for a nation state, a state and institution that's existed for hundreds and hundreds of years, and they had a duty and responsibility, it makes a lot more sense to do that. And it will be clear in people's mind. It won't be ambivalent. We won't be ambivalent like the British government. What is it that they want? Do they want a state or a homeland?
I didn't have in mind actually an apology from the Jewish Zionist lobby. I meant highlighting their role.
Oh, definitely, of course.
Bringing it out to light, because until today many people want to have hash prejudice and not talk about it. The second question is, I don't know whether I can go with the second point.
Yeah, please continue.
The second point is, we are living, now for almost 70 years, current ethnic cleansing, continuous ethnic cleansing, and this is much more, at least for me, for my family, for the Palestinians that I know, it's much more critical actually to focus our eyes on the real culprits who are committing the crimes now. Prosecuting Israel, for me, taking it to international law is more important than seeking an apology from 100 years ago, because we have current actually crimes that are committed as we speak now, every day. And that for me is as much as it is important to seek apology from Britain, it does not actually deal with what is happening now. It does not address, it's actually muddy the waters actually.
Look, I have a lot of sympathy with what you're saying actually, but I don't think it's an either or question. It's not, if you focus on British impact on Palestine, therefore you're somehow blindsided to what's happening on the ground now. We are doing that. Many other organizations continue to do that, lobby for Palestinian refugees. This is partly why PRC exists, to actually lobby and campaign for Palestinian refugees, highlight their rights under international law, and seek a resolution under international law for them. So it's not an either or question. So we promote the situation now on the ground. This is something that's going on. There's many other organizations that are doing that, and we do that in cooperation. But it doesn't mean we can't also do that. So by doing that, we also we highlight the link that there are instruments and there are policies which Britain adopted. There are situations like, for example, home demolition. These are policies which Britain adopted during 1936. Detention without trial. These are policies which Britain adopted during its mandate. So there is a kind of a follow through. There is an adoption by Israel of many of the British policies. So this is another way of educating and demonstrating there's a clear connection. Britain needs to not apologize, not just for the mandate, but the fact that it left behind a legal instrument, a political situation and institutions which Israel has co-opted in continuation of the repression of the Palestinians. So it's even more the case that Britain should apologize. It's not something intangible, it's clearly tangible. They left behind legal instruments, they left behind political institutions and situations which Israel co-opted. So that connection needs to be made. But it needs to be made not exclusively, it's not an either or, it needs to be made in conjunction with showing what's happening on the ground now. So that's something which we are of course doing and many other organizations are doing. So I sympathize with that, but it's not an either or, they can both go together.
I would also say that I think that one of the points of significance with regard to this campaign for an apology with regard to the British Empire is highlighting I think the realities of the power hierarchies with regard to the conflicts that can often be missed. We're not talking about a conflict between two parties in a political vacuum. And we have to understand that the regional and the global world order is of tremendous significance for understanding the conflict today, as indeed if we go back to the period of the First World War and the years of the mandate. And I think it's a huge red herring to talk about the idea of Zionist power or Jewish power, for example, in trying to explain what happened in Palestine if we go back to the First World War. The reality was that the British government and other European governments, and indeed the United States during the First World War, was convinced of the idea of Jewish power. But the idea of Jewish power and whether or not there is a reality of Jewish power are two very different things. And I have to say that it's a very problematic, to say the least, suggestion to talk about some kind of blanket Jewish lobby that is pulling the strings, pushing the world from one direction to another with regard to the conflict. I think we have to understand the reality that this conflict operates within a very complex political world order, and this conflict is between two small peoples within this wider terrain tapestry of world politics. And I think focusing on the British Empire and its role in the conflict historically also, I think, is useful in encouraging us to think that through as well. What are the complex ways in which the conflict is ongoing in relation to all of the different institutions of power on the world stage? Whether we're talking about the United States or whether we're talking about the European Union and quote-unquote the so-called international community. We've only got a few minutes left, actually.
Can I ask a question? Please.
Can we just have a couple more? Can we just have this question here and this one here before we finish it? So if you could begin.
Thank you very much. David Pima from Performing Arts. Thank you very much. I just wondered, coming at a slightly different angle here, during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, as I'm sure you know, obviously, in South Africa, post-1994, where the apartheid regime's cabinet ministers and ultimately the apartheid regime president at the time apologized for apartheid. During that whole Truth and Reconciliation Commission process, together with the foot soldiers, as it were. And at the time, there was a lot of debate, not only for an apology from the apartheid regime leaders and ideologues and ultimate thinkers behind the foot soldiers, but whether to go back before 1948, when apartheid began in South Africa, but only South Africa, was went out of the Commonwealth after 1961. So there was that period of interim that's still very linked to the British Commonwealth, British Empire. And I wondered if there's a beginning of an emerging debate, which had been from the past, now in the country, also of looking back further in history and finding similar analogies to what you're alluding to in terms of the original concentration camps, the region does that, etc., who imprisoned Gandhi, who imprisoned this one, etc., in South Africa. And I wondered, in terms of a broader decolonizing debate, or in terms of post-colonial discourse, if there was any connection with any of these emerging figures in South Africa in terms of your own movement?
I think what you're describing more is it's really national soul searching. Really, it's putting behind the wounds of history, and that's something each nation, each country, as they emerge as one unity, one country, whether it be South Africa, whether it be Australia, that's something as nations they must do and they should do. So if you ever envisage a situation where there is a one Palestinian state where you have Jews and Palestinians all living together, I think that's something they will have to do, truth and reconciliation and a recognition that there was abuse and persecution. So that has to happen, but that's something between the nation itself, if a nation does emerge, if a state does emerge in the future sometime. But the moment, it's not something we can actually promote. It's something which nations can promote, truth and reconciliation, once they emerge as a nation state. For us, it's more a process of education and awareness that Britain has a responsibility and a duty, which it clearly did, and to highlight that. If that results in the end in an initiative of truth and reconciliation within the Palestinians and the Jewish communities in Palestine, that would be really great if that starts as some kind of a debate. But I think for us it's too early to have that kind of scenario.
There are now figures in South Africa who are wanting to go back in history to British and Dutch rule over the last 400 years. And look for there in terms of apology. I wondered if you were in contact with any of those.
Oh no, we're not actually, no. But that's good to know. But we're not in contact with any of those, no. It's but as I said, the inspiration was mainly the recognition of the centenary of Balfour Declaration and also the Mamo case. But I think what you said, as I said, is something that I think will be done ultimately. There needs to be some kind of a truth and reconciliation within Palestine itself. If it happens in our lifetime, I don't know. But it's not something we are actually doing right now.
I think it is useful, though, to see Israel, Palestine, and this question of the role played by the British Empire. It's clearly part of a moment. There is a groundswell. You were talking about how galvanised by the Mau Mau ruling, about this, the developments in political thought in South Africa, and certainly there's going to be a whole host of developments after the British expression of regret, right? Last year about Kenya, and I think we are definitely living in the midst of this moment of really thinking through more widely the question of post-colonial legacies now, and memory, and perhaps restitution. But we have one last question before we end our session.
Thanks for that, James. Good to see you, Nasim. My name's James Renton. I'm from Liverpool. I'm just listening to what you're saying. I'm sort of feeling a little bit bamboozled at the moment, because I've come to the conclusion that what we've just really heard and what this is about is some kind of like apologist for the British Empire and what the British Empire have done. And I actually completely concur with our friend there, 47 years exile from Palestine, who know better than that lady. That what seems to be happening is that this does seem to be like a bit confusing and muddy in the waters, in that what you're doing is you're negating completely, and you did it as well, James, this concept of the Zionist lobby and what the Zionists are actually capable of and leading us up to get us to the point to where we are today. The power and influence is immeasurable. That's why you are where you are. I mean, really, realistically, you have to look at what is today. And Palestine has been stitched up like the proverbial British kipper, is the truth of the matter. And it's being done primarily through the Zionist lobby. That's just a complete matter of record as far as I can see. My question is, though, with regard to two-part question, if you like. One is with relation to the claim that's there from the Jewish Israelis. The claim that they actually have is that it's a claim of a land claim with regards to a biblical land claim. So that Jesus saw the Bible came along and they said, this is your land, you can have your land, that's it. And that's part of the claim, is my understanding of it. It's a sort of a allodial land claim based on what God said to get us where we are today. So the two parts of the question really. The first part is, what do you believe, what's your view on the information that's come to light regarding the Khazarian side of it, so that the people that are there are not the people of Israel, and over 80% plus of them are not even have any historical link whatsoever with the area. And the other part of the question is, you want an apology, yeah? I'm sorry, I'm British, I'm sorry, I'll say it here and now, I'm really sorry. I'm sorry for my friend over there, the South African man as well. I'm sorry that we created the first ever concentration camps and killed thousands and thousands of men, women and children, innocent there. I'm sorry for what happened to the Chinese people. I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for the Sassoons that were behind the importation of the opium. I'm sorry for all that. I'll say all that now. But what I want to ask you is, what is it that you really want? Because I can't understand what it is that you want. You want some kind of an apology. What's that? You'll get an apology. What does that mean? What's that got to do with anything? What you've got is the practicalities of what's happening now to your people in your country.
Thanks.
You need to speak out a bit more about it. Because I mean, I'm from Liverpool. I'm angry for you. I'm angry for you, for your people, and I don't hear it, I don't feel it here, and I think that's what you should be doing. And you, James, saying that some kind of an apologist for the British Empire is a complete and utter, to use your expression, red herring. Deflecting
from the crimes that are happening now as we speak.
I think it's going to highlight that, bring it into a highlight.
Well,
frightening.
can I just make a quick point about? Well, there's a lot to touch on. I mean, I can't address everything. I mean, whether it matters or not, I'm not Palestinian, by the way. I mean, that's probably, but I'm passionate about the issue, but I'm not Palestinian.
You're speaking on behalf of the
I'm speaking on behalf of the Palestinians, and I'm speaking on behalf of PRC regarding the campaign. And I think there is a difference between an apology from a government and an apology from a private individual like yourself. There's a clear difference. An apology, I clearly believe anyway, a child does not bear the burden of the father or the grandfather. You don't do that. It's not you who needs to apologize. You're not the one who perpetrated this. This is a political issue. And a political apology is very different to a private apology. A political apology is a recognition and admission of historical culpability, of historical crimes. And if a country is willing to make a political apology like that, there are consequences of that. There are consequences which you might not see now, but there are consequences of what happens, what other things Palestinians can pursue on an international legal stage. There's other legal avenues which they can pursue to actually pursue their legal and humanitarian rights right now. There's things they can do and they can pursue. But that's not something that can come out in a vacuum. That's something that will come out if, for example, there is a campaign like this, and if Britain was to apologise, I don't think they will, but if Britain was to apologise, the institution, the British government, if they were to apologise, there are consequences for that. So it's not something, it's not a red herring, it's not, as I said, muddying the water. If anything, for me, it's adding to the discussion, adding to the debate that there is a clear link between British policy during its mandate and the destruction of Palestine and what's happening now. I don't think people I speak to, I don't think they're ambiguous and they're ambivalent about this. Of course, there's a clear link. There was a colonial agenda, and it created a colonial situation, and Britain fostered the creation of the Zionist state and the continued repression of the Palestinians. That's without doubt the case. But if we were to, but everyone says that, everyone does that. You know, and we want to highlight that more, and it's true. But as I said, it's not either or. We can do this and that. And if anything, to me, it adds to the debate, it adds to discussion. And if there is an apology, there are clear legal implications which Palestinians, as I said, will pursue. It's another way of securing Palestinian rights and trying to end the colonization and ethnic cleansing of Palestine. It's another strategy. So I don't think you should undermine the efforts. I don't think you should undermine the intention. It's a strategy. It's been going on for 6 decades now. People are trying so many different things to actually help the Palestinian people end their occupation. People are trying many different things. And if we cannot commemorate Balfour Declaration or remember the Balfour Declaration in 4 years' time without something different, something significant, something which galvanizes people around the world, if we can't do that, then and if we go through the same routine of campaigning, same thing which we've been doing for decades, I don't think it says much about the Palestinian community and the Palestinian solidarity movement. They need to add something more to highlight the historical crime committed against the Palestinians. So that's one way of doing it. We might not be perfect, but it's one way of adding to the debate, adding to the discussion. So I don't think it's muddying the water. It's, if anything, it's clarifying a historical crime and showing the clear link between what happened from 22, 48, and there's a clear link. There's a clear link between the two. And hopefully there will be good consequences, good outcomes which Palestinians can hold on to and use as instruments and tools to actually, not just morally, but legally pursue in securing their human rights.
Thank you. I'd like to say briefly, I think that words really do matter in global politics. And if we think that the story that we're talking about today begins with merely a letter from the British Foreign Secretary to Lord Rothschild, in which he pledged British support for merely facilitating, nothing more, the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. Words in a letter. And I think it would be difficult to make the case that those words did not have massive political consequences. And I also strongly believe that these words of apology are of huge significance, and that this is realised clearly within Whitehall. And for this reason, there is a refusal, even after the Mau case, to accept liability for what happened, because as Nasim said, about the consequences that would flow from that, and indeed their refusal that there's any application at all to the Mau Mau ruling to other chapters in colonial history.